And once we have looked at the synchronous approach, like promised, I also would want to show you the asynchronous. And as always, let's start by creating a new file. Again, in my case, that is going to be 10 hyphen, and then I'm going to go with FA sync and JS. And of course, I'll grab everything in the app.js and then just copy and paste. And then back in the app.js, I would want to change these names. So I'm not looking anymore for the read file sync. I'm actually looking for a method by the name of read file. So this is going to be the asynchronous one, and the same goes with write file. Now, of course, we can remove all of this code as well. And the way the asynchronous method works, we need to provide a callback. And if you're familiar with callback, essentially what it means is that we run that callback when we're done. So when whatever functionality we're doing is complete, then we run that callback, just like we normally would do with add event listener on a button. Remember, we go with add event listener, we add whatever the event, of course, with the button, that would be a click event, and then pass in the callback function. And that callback function will run every time we click on a button. So this is the same thing where we have the read file function, and we can simply use it since, of course, we have the structured. Then we need to provide a path. So again, we go with / content, and then the file name is first.txt. And this is where we provide that second argument, and that is going to be a callback function. Now, in that callback function, we pass in 2 more arguments. First one is going to be error, if there is one, as well as the result. And then inside of the body, first, I would want to check if there is an error, and then I can just return null, as well as maybe console log. So we go with if error, and then we'll say return null, or simply return whatever you'd want. And if you want, you of course can console log the error as well, like so. And then if everything is correct, well, then of course I'll have access to my data, which of course has the name, the parameter name of result. And since I would simply want to console log the result, I'm going to go with console log and the result. But of course, keep in mind that this is where you would set up the functionality. So let's go back, and we're going to go with node app.js. And in this case, something really interesting where we don't get the text, right? So we're getting this buffer. So this is what's going to happen, where if we don't provide that UTF coding, then of course we'll get the buffer. Now, where do we add this encoding value? Well, right here, in between the content as well as the path. So let's just go with string, and we're looking for the UTF. So let's say UTF-8, and we'll save that one, and let's run it one more time. And now, of course, I have node app.js, and then hello, this is the first text file. And now the $1 million question. Well, how we can set up the same functionality? Check it out. We have a read file, and then we simply create a new file with both of these values. So if you're familiar with callbacks, you know that, of course, we would need to set up that functionality inside of this callback where I'm getting this result. Otherwise, there's going to be an error, because the only way for me to access this result, if I'm setting this as a callback, is of course inside of this function. And this is what I was saying before, where yes, eventually I'll show you a different approach, because inevitably we'll set up a callback help, and you'll see that in a second. So what I would want to do right now when I get back my first text file, well, now of course I would want to assign it to some kind of variable, and then I would want to read that second file, right? And then eventually, once I read the second file, then of course I would want to create that new file. And the way it's going to look like, I'm going to go with const, and I'll say first, and you can name it first text. I'm just going to go with first, and this will be equal to my result. Okay, awesome. And then right after that result, again, I'm going to go with read file, and then the same thing. We provide a path, so we go with content, and then in this case, of course, we're looking for second and then txt. Then we need to provide the encoding, so Node knows how to decode that. and we go with UTF-8. And then, of course, we need to provide our callback. Again, same deal. We go with error and result. And in order to speed this up, I will copy and paste. So just grab everything starting with if and ending with result, copy and paste. Again, this is the case where we're checking for the error first. If there is an error, we console log it. And if everything is successful, we assign this one to the second one. And then eventually now I want to set up my write file. So again, it is a function. We need to provide that value. And we already have result sync txt. That's why I'll create a new one and I'll call this result and async. So again, we're looking for the content. Then we go with the file name, which is going to be result and async and txt. Of course, since there is no file, Node will create that for us. I'll right away set up my data. Now, if you want, of course, you can copy and paste this functionality. This is totally up to you, where basically we use two of them. And in my case, this is exactly what I'm going to do in order to speed this up. If you want to create something from the scratch, of course, that is also an option. And I'm just going to copy and paste. That's my template string. And again, if you want to add this flag, you can definitely do so. In my case, I'm just going to omit that. So here's the result. I have first and second. And the reason why I have access to them, because of course, I'm looking in the outside scope of this callback function. And then again, we have a callback function in the right file. I know there's tons of callback functions. That's why we'll have to set up a better setup when we're handling these callbacks. But we'll do that a little bit later. So for now, let's just add a comment here where we have first parameter, second parameter, and then the third parameter. And of course, this is going to be, again, our callback where we have error and result. And then inside of this callback, finally, we can take a look at the value. And of course, the value will be in this result. Now, of course, we're creating the file and all that, but hopefully you get the gist that if you would be doing something where you're looking for this result, of course, it would be over here. So again, let's check for error quickly. If there is an error, then of course, I would want to return as well as console log the error just in case. And if everything is correct, let me just console log the result. So I'll save it here. And two things we need to watch out for. Maybe there's an error. And second one, we should create a new file by the name of result and then async txt. Let me clear the console and we're going to run node app.js. And I do get an error. And error simply tells me that I did not add the dot in front of the content. So I would need to go back to write file and just add dot. And once we add the dot, we are going to be in good place where I'll clear the console and I'll run one more time node app.js. And then the result will be undefined. Okay, that's fine. Like I said, in this case, we're not expecting anything back. But what's really cool that in the result async, we should have our text. Here is the result. Hello, this is first text. And then the second text. So hopefully it is clear. This is how we would use the async pattern. So let me zoom out right now here and you'll see this famous callback hell. And in the next video, I would want to give you a brief description of what are the differences between the asynchronous approach or non-blocking approach and the blocking one, the synchronous one, as well as what are the alternatives to this callback hell. All right, and just to give you an early taste of the differences between the asynchronous or non-blocking and synchronous, which is a blocking code, why don't we set up a few console logs? Now, before we do that, I will create a new file and I'll say 11 here. And by the way, I definitely need to zoom in just so you don't think that I'm cheating. FS and async JS. And let's go to the app.js. We'll select everything and copy and paste. And of course, in the next video, we'll set up a different module in this app.js. So for the time being, I can just remove it. And then, like I promised, we'll set up some console logs. So why don't we go back to FS? And by the way, during this video, I'll zoom out because I definitely want to go back to this evil callback hell that we're getting from nesting callback within the callback. And as far as Async, let me zoom in. And why don't we set up a console log in a few places? Let's say before we're accessing the file. So I'm going to go with log and we'll say start. Then we're going to go with write file sync. And then right after that, we're going to say I'm done with the task. And then inside there, let's write done with this task, copy and paste. And we're going to go with starting the next one, starting the next one, meaning the next task. So that should do it. And now, of course, I need to go with clear. So clear my console. And I'm going to go to node. And then the file name is 10 hyphen and then fs. And we're looking for sync. I run it and notice something interesting where I have the start. So that is going to be before I read the files. And only then, once I'm done writing that file, I have done with this task and starting a next one. And what we need to imagine that, of course, this task of getting those files as well as the second one of setting up that file, well, it might be very time consuming, right? And imagine that if we have even 10 users and they're all the time using our application. And if, for example, this one user does this one task or both of them, and they take really long time, what means that Node is not going to be able to serve other users. And trust me, it is at the end of the day, really, really big deal. And notice how JavaScript is reading this code synchronously. It just goes line by line. So we start with this task, then we read these files, and then we write the result. And again, if this is something that takes really long time, then pretty much your application is down. So no other user can do anything with that application because one of the users is, for example, reading these two files and then writing one. Again, this is a very simple example, but you need to picture that, of course, there's going to be tasks that take longer time. And as an alternative, let's take a look at the async approach. So here again, we'll set up some simple console logs. And again, we'll cover this in a bigger detail a bit later. For time being, let's just set up console logs and you'll see the biggest difference. Where I'm going to go with log and let's say start. So I'm going to do that before I read this file. And then I would want to go inside of the write file, the last one. And instead of console logging result, which of course is undefined, since in this case, we are not getting anything back. Now I want to go with done with this task. And then right after my first read file, I'm going to go with log and starting next task. Hopefully you're able to follow along again before the read file, inside of the write file, and then right after the first read file, because of course the other ones are nested inside of this callback. And then if we go to node and if we just change it around to 11 and then FA, and I believe it was async, and if we run it, notice something cool where I have my start and then I right away have this starting next task. And eventually I have this done with this task. So what this means is that since we have this asynchronous approach, the moment we start this task, we just offload. We just offload this task and we continue with our code. So that way, when user number one, for example, comes here and wants to get this functionality, yeah, sure. Here, Node, just offload this task and then your application can keep on serving other users. Again, it seems a bit trivial at the moment because we have a basic approach, but hopefully you get an idea. Where in one case, we have everything happening line by line. So only when we're done with the task, we're starting a next one. And with this approach, we start a task and we just offload that task and then we start a next task right away. And eventually, yes, we have done with this task in a console as well. Now, as far as the implementation, as far as the callbacks, yes, this is a bit messy, right? Notice how we only want to accomplish few tasks and it's already somewhat of a pain. Now, alternatives are using promises as well as async await. Now, again, hopefully you understand that when we talk about reading the file as well as the writing of file, I use this as an example of some kind of task that would take a long time. Now, for the remainder of the course, mostly it's going to be reading from the database, writing to the database, and that sort of thing. But this is a very good illustration of how some task would take some time. So, of course, we would need to use a callback. And as far as the callbacks, yes, you can use them, but the code is going to get messy somewhat quickly. That's why a bit later in the course, we'll take a look at the alternatives, which are promises and async await. And I have to tell you honestly, for the remainder of the course, we'll use async await because, in my opinion, it is just easier to work with. Excellent. And up next, we have HTTP module. But before we continue, let me just mention that I purposely won't spend too much time on explaining every single HTTP method we're going to use in great detail. And here's why. You see, starting from next section, all of our work, meaning code, in some shape or form, will revolve around server setup, aka HTTP module. So at that point, of course, I will cover every last bit of syntax in great detail. At this point, though, I think it's just a waste of our time. So if you're confused about something HTTP related, don't sweat it. We will return to that subject shortly and cover it in far greater detail. Now, if you're wondering why we bother with HTTP module at this point at all, since we're going to use it later anyway, you see, with the help of HTTP module, I believe I can show you some core features of Node in action and give you somewhat of a visual representation of them. Otherwise, I would have to base everything on slides, and I don't think it's the best approach. So, long story short, if you're iffy about something HTTP related, just please be patient and I'll answer all your questions in the next course section. Nice. I think we've got a good initial understanding of how the file system module works in Node, and hopefully I did not lose too many of you. So hopefully there are still some students left in the course, because I fully understand that seeing this for the first time is probably a bit overwhelming. And what I would want to do next is cover the last initial module, the built-in module, and that is going to be the HTTP module, which is going to allow us to set up a web server. Now, please keep in mind one thing. We'll just cover the basics because the large part of this course is going to be creating your own server and setting up the API. Now, granted, we will use an abstraction on top of the HTTP module, and that is going to be the package by the name of Express. But the whole point is going to be exactly the same. That's why, again, we're not going to cover everything in greatest detail at the moment because I don't see the point of repeating myself. And now I want to go back to app.js. I'll zoom back in just so you can see better what is happening. By the way, let me check my zoom level. So I'm going with settings, and I think that should do it. My zoom level is 2 at the moment. And then back in the app.js, let's grab the HTTP module and we'll assign it to some kind of variable as always. Let's go with a require, and we're looking for HTTP. That's the module name. And the method we would want to use is create server. Again, we'll assign this to some kind of variable. And in this case, the variable name will be server. Then we go with HTTP, create server. And this create server method is looking for the callback. And in that callback function, we have 2 parameters. And both of those parameters are objects. And since they're parameters, you can call it whatever you would want. But a common practice is calling them rec and res. Now, this first parameter represents the incoming request. So imagine a client is requesting from the web browser your web page. So you'll have information about the method and all kinds of useful stuff in that request object. And the response is what we're sending back. Now, we're not done. Of course, we'll set up more code here. But before we do anything, we also would need to specifically say what port our server is going to be listening to. And that's why we'll go with server and listen. So that's another method. And again, this is arbitrary, but I'm going to go with 5,000. Again, if this looks like a lot of gibberish where we have the request, response, as well as the ports, don't worry. Later in the course, I'll cover that in more detail, as well as show you some useful slides and all that good stuff. And as far as the response, well, we have few methods. We have write, so we go with res, and again, this is the object. And notice here how I'm not using the rec yet, so I'm not checking for anything. I'm just concerned about my response, and the method name is write. And inside the write, we just come up with some kind of text, and I'll say welcome to our homepage. And once we have sent back the response, I also would want to end my request. So I'm going to go with res.end. And once we're done setting up the code inside of the callback function, now, of course, I would want to open up my terminal, clear everything, and we would need to spin the sucker up. And of course, the way we do that is node and then app.js. Since that is the file name, make sure that you save it though. So before I run, I'll save it. And then notice something interesting. Notice how we're not exiting. So previously, every time we ran the file, every time we ran node and then whatever the file name, we exited from the file, right? So node was done executing the code and we just moved on. Now, in this case, since we have a web server, well, what do web servers do? They keep on listening for requests. And actually, you want your server to always be up. And of course, if I go to my web browser, and then I'll make this bigger. And if we go with localhost, and of course, in this case, we have 5,000. There it is. We have welcome to our homepage. So now, of course, we have effectively created our first website. Now, granted,